The rain fell in cold sheets over Vienna on the night of September 11, 1683. On the walls surrounding the city, severed heads stared down from stakes, their eyes hollow, mouths frozen in silent screams. These were defenders who had fought too hard, died too slowly, their bodies mutilated as warnings to those still alive inside. Below, in the Ottoman camp, officers sat under silk tents, drinking wine looted from Austrian villages, laughing, already dividing the spoils of a city that hadn't fallen yet. Inside Vienna's walls, a mother crouched in a cellar, her hand pressed over her infant's mouth, muffling cries that could draw attention, could mean death. The city was starving, dying, waiting for a miracle that rational men said would never come. If Vienna fell, nothing stood between the Ottoman Empire and Rome. Paris would be next. Every cathedral, every throne, every Christian kingdom in Europe would face the same choice: convert, submit, or die. This wasn't just a siege. This was the moment Western civilization stood on the edge of extinction, and almost no one outside Vienna's walls understood how close the end really was. To understand how Europe reached this breaking point, you need to understand the Ottoman Empire at its height. This wasn't some regional power. This was a superpower that had been expanding for 3 centuries, swallowing empires, erasing kingdoms, rewriting the map of 3 continents. Constantinople, the capital of Eastern Christianity, fell in 1453 to Sultan Mehmed II, ending 1,000 years of Roman continuity. The Ottomans took the Balkans, absorbed Hungary, dominated the Mediterranean, and pushed into the heart of Europe. Their military machine was terrifying. The Janissaries, elite infantry corps recruited through the Devshirme system, were Christian boys taken from their families, converted to Islam, and trained from childhood to be fanatic warriors loyal only to the Sultan. They were disciplined, ruthless, and feared across Europe. The Ottoman cavalry, Sipahis, were shock troops who'd shattered armies from Vienna to Baghdad, and their artillery was the best in the world. Massive siege cannons, some weighing tons, could reduce fortifications to rubble. The empire stretched from Algeria to the Persian Gulf, from the gates of Vienna to the Indian Ocean. 60 million people lived under Ottoman rule. No European power could match them alone. In 1683, Sultan Mehmed IV sat on the throne in Istanbul, a ruler more interested in hunting than governing. Real power rested with his Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha, an ambitious, arrogant man who saw Vienna as his ticket to immortality. Mehmed the Conqueror had taken Constantinople. Suleiman the Magnificent had reached the gates of Vienna in 1529 but failed to take the city. Kara Mustafa would succeed where Suleiman failed. He would capture Vienna, march on Rome, and force all of Christian Europe to bow before Ottoman power. The plan was bold, achievable, and terrifying. Kara Mustafa assembled the largest army the Ottoman Empire had ever sent into Europe. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 troops marched from Istanbul in spring 1683. Janissaries, Sipahis, Tartars from the Crimea, vassal troops from Wallachia and Moldavia, engineers, camp followers, thousands of camels carrying supplies, and hundreds of massive siege cannons. The army stretched for miles, a moving city of tents and wagons, heading northwest toward Vienna. European spies reported the army's size, and panic spread. No single Christian power could stop this force. If Vienna fell, the rest would collapse like dominoes. Pope Innocent XI understood the stakes. He was old, in poor health, but driven by a vision of united Christendom standing against the Islamic tide. For years, he'd been trying to organize a coalition, but Christian kings spent more time fighting each other than facing common threats. France and the Holy Roman Empire were rivals. Poland and Austria had border disputes. The Protestant and Catholic split made cooperation difficult, but the Pope didn't give up. He wrote letters, sent envoys, threatened excommunication, bribed, cajoled, and slowly assembled what would become the Holy League. The key figure was Emperor Leopold I of the Holy Roman Empire, who ruled Austria and nominal control over a patchwork of German states. Leopold was cautious, indecisive, more diplomat than warrior. When reports confirmed the Ottoman army was marching toward Vienna, Leopold panicked. He didn't believe the city could be defended. He evacuated, fleeing to Linz with his court, leaving Vienna's defense to Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg and a garrison of maybe 15,000 troops. The people of Vienna watched their emperor abandon them, and morale collapsed. If Leopold didn't believe the city could hold, why should they? But Starhemberg believed. He was a career soldier, 60 years old, and had no illusions about what was coming. The Ottomans would besiege the city, bombard it, mine the walls, and eventually storm through the breaches. His job was to hold long enough for relief forces to arrive. If relief didn't come, everyone inside would die. Starhemberg organized the defense methodically. He stockpiled food, ammunition, and medical supplies. He conscripted every able-bodied man into militia units. He reinforced walls, positioned artillery, and prepared for months of siege. The civilian population, maybe 60,000 people, was trapped inside. There would be no evacuation. Women, children, elderly, everyone would share the defenders' fate. Starhemberg made sure they understood this. No one was leaving, no one was surrendering. They would hold or die. The Ottoman army arrived at Vienna on July 14, 1683. Kara Mustafa set up his headquarters in a luxurious tent complex outside the city, complete with gardens, fountains, and a menagerie that included a pet lion. He surveyed Vienna's walls and made a decision that would haunt him. Instead of launching immediate assaults to take the city quickly, he decided on a methodical siege. He wanted Vienna intact. The city was wealthy, filled with treasures, libraries, gold, and potential slaves. If his troops stormed the walls, they'd loot and burn everything. A patient siege would starve the defenders, force surrender, and deliver the city undamaged into his hands. He had time. No relief force was imminent. The city would fall eventually, and he'd claim the glory without destroying the prize. It was logical, rational, and completely wrong. The bombardment began immediately. Ottoman cannons positioned on earthworks fired day and night, smashing into Vienna's walls. The noise was constant, overwhelming, driving people mad. Buildings collapsed. Fires broke out. The defenders worked frantically to repair damage, shoring up walls with timber and rubble, but the bombardment was relentless. Worse than the cannons were the mines. Ottoman engineers, the best in the world, began digging tunnels under Vienna's walls. They'd tunnel close to the foundations, pack the chambers with gunpowder, and detonate explosions that would collapse entire sections of wall. Starhemberg organized countermining operations, digging tunnels to intercept Ottoman sappers before they reached the walls. Underground, in narrow passages lit by torches, men fought with knives, picks, and bare hands. Sometimes they'd break into an enemy tunnel and fight in the dark. Sometimes they'd hear digging nearby and try to flood the tunnel or collapse it with explosives. The psychological strain was immense. You never knew when the ground beneath you would explode. Inside the city, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food ran low. Rationing was strict, but supplies dwindled. People ate horses, dogs, rats, anything with meat. They ground sawdust into flour to make bread that had no nutritional value, but filled stomachs and quieted hunger pains temporarily. Disease spread. Dysentery, typhus, cholera. The hospitals overflowed with wounded and sick. Doctors worked without sleep, amputating shattered limbs, treating burns, trying to save lives with medieval tools and no anesthetics. The death toll climbed daily. Mass graves were dug inside the city because burying bodies outside the walls was impossible. Morale collapsed and recovered and collapsed again. Starhemberg was everywhere, on the walls during bombardments, in the hospitals comforting the wounded, in the churches leading prayers. His presence held the city together. If Starhemberg believed they could hold, maybe they could. By late August, the situation was critical. Multiple breaches had been blown in the walls. Ottoman troops probed the defenses, testing weak points, preparing for a general assault. The defenders repelled these probes, but casualties mounted. Starhemberg sent desperate messages to Leopold, to the Pope, to anyone who might send help. Relief was coming, he was told. A coalition army was assembling. Hold on. Just hold on, but how much longer could they hold? Ammunition was running low. Gunpowder stocks were depleted. The garrison was down to maybe 4,000 effectives, exhausted men on the edge of collapse. One more week, maybe two, and the city would fall. The Ottomans knew this. Kara Mustafa prepared for a final assault. He'd breach the walls in multiple places simultaneously, overwhelm the defenders with numbers, and take the city before relief arrived. Victory was days away, but the relief was closer than Kara Mustafa realized. Pope Innocent XI had succeeded in assembling a coalition. King Jan III Sobieski of Poland, a battle-hardened commander who'd spent his life fighting Ottomans and Tatars, agreed to lead the relief force. Sobieski was in his 50s, overweight, plagued by gout, but still one of Europe's best generals. He understood Ottoman tactics, respected their capabilities, and knew how to beat them. He brought 27,000 Polish troops, including 3,000 winged hussars, the most feared cavalry in Europe. These were heavy cavalry, armored knights who charged in formation with wings attached to their backs, wooden frames covered in feathers that created a terrifying roar as they rode. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical charge. Enemies broke and ran when they saw the hussars coming. Sobieski also brought tactical brilliance. He'd studied Ottoman warfare, knew their strengths and weaknesses, and had a plan. The German princes contributed troops as well. Charles V, Duke of Lorraine, commanded the imperial forces, maybe 20,000 men from Austria and Bavaria. Other German states sent contingents. The total relief force numbered around 65,000 to 70,000 troops, smaller than the Ottoman army, but mobile, motivated, and unified under a single command structure. Sobieski and the German princes met at Tulln, northwest of Vienna, in early September. There was tension. The Germans resented taking orders from a Polish king. Sobieski didn't care. The Pope had given him overall command, and Sobieski made it clear they would fight as one army under one commander or they'd die separately. The princes agreed. They didn't have a choice. The Ottoman army besieging Vienna was the most immediate threat Europe had faced in a century. Defeating it required unity, discipline, and flawless execution. On September 11, the relief force reached the Kahlenberg, a mountain overlooking Vienna from the northwest. From the heights, they could see the entire battlefield spread below. Vienna was surrounded by Ottoman siege lines, trenches, artillery positions, and tent camps stretching for miles. The city was still holding, smoke rising from fires inside the walls, but barely. Sobieski surveyed the terrain and formulated his plan. The coalition would descend from the Kahlenberg in 3 columns, German forces on the left and center, Polish forces on the right. They'd engage the Ottoman army in a massive frontal assault, pushing them back from the city walls. Once the Ottomans were committed, locked in combat with the infantry, Sobieski would unleash the winged hussars in a cavalry charge that would smash through the Ottoman center and break their entire army. It was a simple plan, relying on shock and momentum, and it required perfect timing. Release the cavalry too early, and they'd be isolated and destroyed. Too late, and the infantry would be overwhelmed. Sobieski had to judge the moment exactly right. Inside Vienna, the defenders saw signal rockets fired from the Kahlenberg. Relief was here. The message spread through the city like wildfire. Men who'd been ready to give up found renewed strength. Kahlenberg ordered a final defense of the breaches. They had to hold one more day, just one more day, and rescue would arrive. The garrison, down to maybe 4,000 men capable of fighting, manned the walls, loaded cannons, and prepared for what they knew would be the Ottomans' final assault. If the Ottomans broke through before the relief force engaged, the city would fall regardless of what happened outside. Everything depended on timing. Kara Mustafa saw the coalition army on the Kahlenberg and made another fatal decision. He should have abandoned the siege, pulled his troops back, and formed defensive lines to face the incoming attack. Instead, he tried to do both, continue the siege and defend against the relief force simultaneously. He split his army, leaving troops in the siege lines to storm Vienna's walls while positioning others to face the coalition. This divided his forces, weakened both efforts, and created confusion in the command structure. Ottoman generals argued for full commitment to one objective or the other. Kara Mustafa overruled them. He believed he could take Vienna before the coalition engaged meaningfully, then turn and crush them with superior numbers. It was the mistake that doomed him. September 12, 1683, dawned clear and hot. The coalition army began its descent from the Kahlenberg at dawn, moving in massive columns down through the Vienna woods. The terrain was difficult, forested hills that limited visibility and cohesion, but the coalition forces maintained discipline. By mid-morning, they emerged from the woods and engaged the Ottoman forces defending the approaches to Vienna. The battle that followed was one of the largest in European history, involving over 230,000 troops fighting across miles of open ground and forest. The German forces on the left and center attacked Ottoman positions, driving them back slowly. The fighting was brutal, hand-to-hand combat in some areas, artillery exchanges in others. The Ottomans fought hard, but they were disorganized, split between the siege and the relief battle, unable to concentrate their forces effectively. Ottoman cavalry, Sepahis and Tartars, charged the German lines repeatedly, trying to break through, but the German infantry held. Slowly, over 6 hours, the coalition pushed the Ottomans back, compressing them into a smaller and smaller area between the coalition army and Vienna's walls. Sobieski watched the battle unfold from a command post on the heights, waiting for the right moment. The Polish forces had been held in reserve, positioned on the right flank, ready to charge. The winged hussars sat on their horses, wings rustling in the wind, lances ready, waiting. The infantry battle raged below, thousands of men locked in combat, the outcome still uncertain. Sobieski judged the situation carefully. The Ottomans were committed now, their reserves engaged, their cavalry spent. The center was exposed. If the hussars charged now, they'd hit the Ottoman army at its weakest point, right when exhaustion and confusion were at their peak. Sobieski gave the order. At approximately 5:00 p.m., 18,000 heavy cavalry, including 3,000 winged hussars, began their charge. It was the largest cavalry charge in history. 18,000 horsemen, formed in tight ranks, thundered down the slopes of the Kahlenberg toward the Ottoman lines. The ground shook. The sound was overwhelming, thousands of hooves pounding the earth, armor clanking, the scream of the hussar wings creating a noise like demons descending from hell. The Ottomans saw them coming and panicked. They'd faced cavalry charges before, but nothing like this. The mass, the speed, the sound, it was psychologically devastating. Units broke before the charge even reached them, soldiers throwing down weapons and running. Those who stood and fought were trampled or cut down by lances lowering in perfect unison. The hussars smashed through the Ottoman center like a battering ram through rotten wood. The entire Ottoman line disintegrated. Soldiers fled in every direction, abandoning positions, equipment, everything. The army that had besieged Vienna for 2 months collapsed in less than an hour. Kara Mustafa watched his army evaporate and fled. He abandoned his headquarters, his treasure, his menagerie, even the Sultan's personal standard, a sacred symbol that should never fall into enemy hands. He ran, escaping with a small bodyguard, leaving behind an army that was no longer an army, but a panicked mob being slaughtered by Polish and German cavalry. The Ottomans lost maybe 20,000 dead on the battlefield. Thousands more were captured or died fleeing through hostile territory. The coalition captured the entire Ottoman camp, 300 massive siege cannons, hundreds of supply wagons, mountains of gold, jewels, and plunder accumulated over 2 months of siege. Sobieski himself entered Kara Mustafa's tent and found it more luxurious than most European palaces. He allegedly sat in the Grand Vizier's chair and wrote his famous letter to the Pope, Venimus, Vidimus, Deus Vicit, we came, we saw, God conquered. Inside Vienna, the defenders realized the siege was over when Ottoman troops in the siege lines started retreating, then running. Kahlenberg ordered the gates opened and led a sortie that cut down fleeing Ottomans and captured siege equipment. The garrison, skeletal and exhausted, staggered out of the city they defended for 60 days. They'd lost maybe 12,000 troops killed or died of disease. The civilian population had lost another 10,000. The survivors were walking skeletons, starving, traumatized, but alive. Vienna had held. Europe was saved. Sobieski entered Vienna the next day. The population lined the streets, weeping, cheering, throwing flowers. They kissed his boots, his hands, his horse. Children clung to Polish soldiers, crying. Old women knelt in prayer. Sobieski rode through the city in silence, visibly moved. He attended Mass at St. Stephen's Cathedral, where the bishop blessed him as the savior of Christendom. Politically, the victory was complicated. Emperor Leopold resented Sobieski, taking credit for the relief, believing the German forces had contributed as much. Leopold returned to Vienna days later, deliberately avoiding Sobieski, refusing to give the Polish king the recognition he deserved. The tensions between Poland and Austria, papered over during the crisis, resurfaced immediately. Sobieski left Vienna frustrated, knowing he'd saved a city whose emperor couldn't even thank him properly. Kara Mustafa fled to Belgrade, trying to regroup the remnants of his army. He sent desperate messages to Sultan Mehmed IV, blaming subordinates, whether bad intelligence, anything except his own failures. The Sultan wasn't interested in excuses. An army of 150,000 had been destroyed. The empire's prestige was shattered. Someone had to pay. On December 25, 1683, Christmas Day, executioners arrived at Kara Mustafa's residence in Belgrade. He was strangled with a silk cord, the traditional method for executing high-ranking Ottomans. His head was cut off, preserved in honey, and sent to the Sultan in a velvet bag. The Grand Vizier who'd promised to conquer Europe died in disgrace, his failure complete. The Battle of Vienna was a turning point. The Ottoman Empire never recovered the momentum it lost that day. For 250 years, the Ottomans had been expanding, seemingly unstoppable. After Vienna, they were in retreat. Over the next 16 years, a series of campaigns led by Prince Eugene of Savoy and other European commanders liberated Hungary, pushed the Ottomans out of the Balkans, and forced the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699. The Ottomans ceded massive territories, effectively ending their threat to Central Europe. The empire would linger for another 2 centuries, slowly declining, until its final collapse after World War I, but the peak had passed. Vienna marked the high-water mark of Ottoman power, the point where expansion stopped and contraction began. For Europe, the victory had profound consequences. It demonstrated that unity, even temporary and fragile, could defeat threats no single nation could handle alone. The Pope's coalition had worked. Christian kingdoms, despite centuries of rivalry, had cooperated long enough to save themselves. The victory boosted confidence, reduced fear of Ottoman invasion, and allowed European states to focus on internal development. The Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, colonial expansion, all were made possible in part because Europe wasn't fighting for survival against an external existential threat. If Vienna had fallen, European history would have taken a radically different course. Would the Ottomans have conquered all of Europe? Probably not. Logistics, overextension, and European resistance would have prevented total conquest, but they could have taken much more: Austria, Bavaria, perhaps even reaching the Rhine before being stopped. The religious, cultural, and political landscape of Europe would have been transformed. The tactical lessons of Vienna are still studied. The largest cavalry charge in history succeeded because it was deployed at exactly the right moment against an enemy already exhausted and disorganized. Cavalry charges are high-risk maneuvers. If they fail, the cavalry is destroyed. Sobieski's timing was perfect. He waited until the infantry battle had ground down Ottoman cohesion, then unleashed the charge when it would have maximum impact. The charge worked not just because of numbers or shock, but because it hit at the psychological breaking point. The Ottomans were already stretched, already doubting, already nearing collapse. The Hussars were the final push, that shattered their will to resist. Modern military analysts compare Vienna to other decisive cavalry actions: Waterloo, Balaclava, the charge of the Light Brigade. Vienna stands out because the charge succeeded completely, achieving exactly what it was meant to achieve: total enemy collapse. Sobieski's role in the battle made him a legend. He returned to Poland a hero, celebrated in songs, paintings, and poems, but his later years were difficult. Poland's internal politics were chaotic, the nobility fractious and resistant to royal authority. Sobieski struggled to translate military success into political power. He died in 1696, frustrated and exhausted, knowing Poland was weakening while its neighbors grew stronger. Within decades of his death, Poland would be partitioned by Russia, Prussia, and Austria, disappearing from the map entirely. The king who saved Europe couldn't save his own kingdom. History has few ironies sharper than that. The Ottoman Empire, meanwhile, entered a long period of stagnation and decline. Defeats accumulated, military reforms failed, corruption spread. The Janissaries, once the empire's elite, became a reactionary force resisting modernization. European technology and tactics advanced while the Ottomans stagnated. By the 19th century, the empire was called the sick man of Europe, kept alive more by European rivalries than its own strength. When World War I finally destroyed the empire, it was almost a mercy, ending centuries of slow decay. Vienna itself became a symbol. The city that almost fell became a monument to resistance, resilience, and the power of unity against existential threats. The walls that Kahlenberg defended were eventually torn down, replaced by boulevards as Vienna expanded into a modern metropolis, but the memory remained. Every September, Vienna remembers 1683, the summer when the city stood alone, the autumn when Europe's fate hung on a cavalry charge, the day when 18,000 horsemen saved Western civilization. The story became myth, embellished and romanticized, but the core remained true: a city under siege. A coalition army arriving at the last moment, a cavalry charge that changed history. These things happened. The details are documented, the consequences undeniable. Modern historians debate the battle's significance. Some argue it's overstated, that the Ottoman decline was inevitable due to internal weaknesses, that Vienna merely accelerated a process already underway. Others maintain the battle was genuinely decisive, that an Ottoman victory would have reshaped European history. The truth likely lies between these positions. Vienna didn't cause Ottoman decline, but it marked the moment when decline became visible, undeniable. It shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility, gave Europeans confidence, and created momentum that led to decades of successful campaigns against the empire. Was it the single most important battle in European history? That's debatable. Was it among the most important? Absolutely. The human cost deserves recognition. 20,000 Ottomans died on the battlefield. Another 50,000 or more died during the siege or fleeing afterward. Inside Vienna, 22,000 defenders and civilians died. Add in the deaths in surrounding villages destroyed during the Ottoman advance, and the total approaches 100,000. Families across Europe, from Poland to Austria to the Ottoman Empire, lost sons, fathers, brothers. The battle was a catastrophe on a scale hard to comprehend. We remember the victory, the heroism, the dramatic charge. We should also remember the cost. War, even victorious war, is horror. The survivors of Vienna knew this. They'd lived through months of starvation, bombardment, and terror. They'd seen things that haunted them for the rest of their lives. The victory came at a price paid in blood, trauma, and shattered lives. The Battle of Vienna stands as a reminder that history's trajectory isn't inevitable. Small decisions, Kara Mustafa's choice to continue the siege, Sobieski's timing of the charge, Leopold's decision to abandon Vienna, had enormous consequences. If Kara Mustafa had abandoned the siege when the relief force arrived, he could have fought a defensive battle on favorable terrain and possibly won. If Sobieski had charged an hour earlier or later, the hussars might have been repelled, the coalition defeated. If Leopold had stayed in Vienna and surrendered, The siege would have ended without a battle, and Europe's fate would have been different. History turned on these moments, and the people making the decisions didn't have the benefit of hindsight. They made choices based on incomplete information, personal judgment, and luck. Sometimes they chose right, sometimes they didn't. At Vienna, enough people chose right, and Europe survived. The story deserves to be told because it's fundamentally human. It's about people facing impossible odds, making desperate choices, fighting for survival. It's about courage and cowardice, brilliance and stupidity, triumph and tragedy. It's history, but it's also drama, as compelling as any fiction because it actually happened. The mother hiding in the cellar, muffling her baby's cries. The defenders on the walls, starving and exhausted, holding for one more day. The cavalry thundering down the slopes, knowing if they failed everyone would die. The Grand Vizier fleeing in disgrace, strangled weeks later in a cold room in Belgrade. These are real people, real moments, real consequences. Their story echoes across centuries because it speaks to something fundamental about human experience. We face challenges that seem insurmountable. We struggle against forces larger than ourselves. Sometimes we fail. Sometimes, against all odds, we win. Vienna was one of those times when victory seemed impossible, when every calculation said defeat was inevitable, and yet through courage, leadership, and a bit of luck, the impossible happened. That's why we remember. That's why the story matters. September 12, 1683, the day 18,000 horsemen charged down a mountain and changed the world.